May 27th, 1941. 10:47 a.m. Commander John Compton of the British 4th Royal Tank Regiment peered through the narrow vision slit of his Matilda II infantry tank as it rumbled across the hard-packed sand toward Halfaya Pass. The pass itself was barely visible through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor, a narrow defile cutting through the escarpment that separated the coastal plain from the Libyan plateau. Compton had every reason to feel confident. His Matilda, with its 78mm of frontal armour, was virtually impervious to any anti-tank weapon the Germans possessed, or so he believed. The Matilda II represented the pinnacle of British infantry tank design in 1941. Weighing 27 tons and protected by armour that ranged from 20mm on the roof to 78mm on the frontal glacis, it had earned the nickname Queen of the Desert during the earlier campaigns against the Italians. Italian 47mm anti-tank guns had bounced shells off Matildas like pebbles off castle walls. The Italian gunners, facing these slow-moving but impenetrable fortresses, had reportedly wept in frustration as their rounds sparked harmlessly off British armour. But this was no longer a fight against Italians. This was Operation Brevity, Britain's attempt to recapture the strategic positions along the Egyptian-Libyan border that had been lost during Rommel's first offensive. And what Compton didn't know, what British intelligence had failed to adequately warn him about, was that the Germans had transformed Halfaya Pass into a killing ground, using a weapon that was never designed to fight tanks. At the crest of the pass, concealed in carefully prepared positions dug into the rocky escarpment, Oberfeldwebel Ludwig Becker of the 33rd Flak Regiment waited beside his 88mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun. The massive weapon, standing over 7 feet tall with its barrel elevated, had been repositioned during the night. Its original purpose, shooting down aircraft, was about to be redefined in a way that would change armoured warfare forever. Becker and his crew of 11 men had spent the previous 3 days under the scorching sun, using picks and shovels to excavate a position that would allow the 88 to fire horizontally across the desert floor while remaining nearly invisible to approaching tanks. They had removed the gun's wheels and lowered it into a pit until only the barrel and shield protruded above ground level. Rocks and sand had been carefully arranged to break up the weapon's distinctive silhouette. At 200 yards, it was virtually undetectable. The 80mm gun, properly designated the 8.8cm Flak 18/36/37, had evolved from lessons learned in World War I when German forces discovered that existing anti-aircraft weapons were inadequate against increasingly sophisticated aircraft. Development began in secret during the 1920s, when the Treaty of Versailles technically prohibited Germany from producing such weapons. The first prototypes were tested in Sweden and Spain, where German engineers could work without Allied oversight. By 1933, when Hitler openly repudiated the Versailles Treaty, the 88mm Flak had matured into a formidable anti-aircraft weapon. The gun could elevate from -3 degrees to +85 degrees, traverse 360 degrees, and fire a 20-pound shell to an altitude of 26,000 feet. Its rate of fire, 15 to 20 rounds per minute with a well-trained crew, made it lethal against bomber formations, but it was the gun's muzzle velocity that would prove revolutionary in ground combat. The standard armour-piercing round left the barrel at 2,690 feet per second, giving it a flat trajectory and incredible penetrating power. During the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, a handful of 88mm Flak guns had been deployed with the Condor Legion, Germany's contribution to Franco's nationalist forces. It was there, in the chaos of a Republican tank attack near Zaragoza in October 1937, that a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft battery commander named Wilhelm von Thoma made a desperate decision. With no anti-tank guns available and Soviet-supplied T-26 tanks overrunning his position, von Thoma ordered his 88mm guns depressed to fire horizontally. The results astonished everyone present. The high-velocity shells punched through the T-26's armour like it was paper. 7 tanks were destroyed in less than 10 minutes. Von Thoma's after-action report noted the 88's potential as an anti-tank weapon, but the German Army High Command, still committed to the doctrine of specialised anti-tank guns, largely ignored the finding. The 88 remained classified as an anti-aircraft weapon, operated by Luftwaffe Flak units, rather than Army artillery. But Erwin Rommel had read von Thomme's report. When Rommel arrived in North Africa in February 1941 as commander of the newly formed Africa Corps, he brought with him an unorthodox tactical flexibility that would characterize his desert campaigns. Rommel understood that the open terrain of North Africa, with its long sight lines and lack of cover, was ideal for the 88's combination of range and hitting power. He also understood that British tank tactics, developed against poorly equipped Italian forces, emphasized aggressive forward movement with little regard for coordinated infantry artillery support. During his first offensive in March and April 1941, Rommel had experimented with using 88s in the anti-tank role. But these were hasty, improvised deployments. Halfaya Pass would be different. Here, with time to prepare proper positions and clear fields of fire, he would demonstrate the 88's true potential. The pass itself was a natural choke point. Any British force attempting to advance into Libya had to either capture the pass or make a long detour south into the open desert, risking their supply lines. Rommel had fortified the position with infantry, mines and conventional anti-tank guns. But the centrepiece of his defence was a line of 88mm guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire across the approaches to the pass. By late May 1941, the strategic situation had crystallised into a tense stalemate. The British, having been pushed back from their earlier gains by Rommel's surprise offensive, held the Egyptian side of the border. The Germans and Italians controlled the Libyan side, with forward positions at Halfaya Pass, Fort Capuzzo and the Hafid Ridge. Both sides were exhausted, undersupplied, and waiting for reinforcements, but Winston Churchill, facing political pressure after the evacuation of Crete and desperate for a victory to boost British morale, ordered General Archibald Wavell to attack. The result was Operation Brevity, a limited offensive aimed at recapturing the border positions and creating conditions for a larger operation to relieve the besieged garrison at Tobruk. The British plan called for a three-pronged attack. One column would assault Halfaya Pass from the front, a second would attack Fort Capuzzo, a third would sweep around the southern flank to cut off German retreat routes. The force included the 22nd Guards Brigade, elements of the 4th Armoured Brigade, and the 4th Royal Tank Regiment with its Matilda IIs. On paper, it seemed straightforward. In practice, it would be a disaster. The British intelligence assessment of German anti-tank capabilities was fatally flawed. Reports noted the presence of 50mm PaK-38 anti-tank guns, which could penetrate about 60mm of armour at 500 yards. These posed some threat to British cruiser tanks, but were considered insufficient to defeat a Matilda's frontal armour. The intelligence summaries mentioned 88mm Flak guns in the theatre, but classified them as anti-aircraft weapons of minimal concern to ground forces. No one had adequately assessed what those guns could do to a tank. The morning of May 27th broke clear and hot. By 10 a.m, temperatures were already approaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The attacking British tanks kicked up massive dust clouds visible for miles, announcing their approach to every German observer on the escarpment. Commander Compton's squadron of 11 Matildas was part of the frontal assault on Halfaya Pass. The plan called for the heavy infantry tanks to lead the attack, using their superior armour to break through German defences while lighter cruiser tanks exploited the breakthrough. Artillery would provide supporting fire and infantry would follow to consolidate gains. It was the standard British doctrine of the period, and it had worked well against the Italians. Against the Germans at Halfaya Pass it would prove catastrophically inadequate. As Compton's Matildas approached to within 1,500 yards of the pass, they began taking fire from German machine guns and light artillery. The rounds sparked harmlessly off the thick armour. Inside his tank, Compton felt the familiar confidence of near invulnerability. The Matilda's 2-pounder gun, while small, was accurate, and its armour had never been penetrated in combat. He radioed his squadron to maintain formation and continue advancing. At 200 yards, Ludwig Becker centred his sight on the lead Matilda. The 88's optical sight was crude by later standards, but adequate for the task. The target was moving at perhaps 8 miles per hour, barely more than a walking pace. The Matilda's design, optimised for supporting infantry assaults, sacrificed speed for protection. Becker's gun captain gave the fire command. The loader slammed a 20-pound armour-piercing round into the breech. The layer made a final adjustment to elevation. Becker confirmed the target, Fire. The 88mm gun fired with a distinctive crack that echoed across the desert. The recoil drove the weapon backward against its equilibrators. The crew, drilled to mechanical precision, began the reload sequence immediately. The shell, travelling at nearly 2,700 feet per second, covered the 1,200 yards in less than 1.5 seconds. From Compton's perspective, there was no warning. One moment his tank was grinding steadily forward. The next, the world exploded. The 88mm armour-piercing shell struck the Matilda's frontal armour at a near-perpendicular angle. The laws of physics were brutal and unforgiving. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. The 88's high velocity translated into enormous penetrating power. The shell, its hard steel core backed by explosive energy that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier, punched through 78mm of armour plate as if it were tin. The round penetrated the tank's fighting compartment and detonated among the ammunition storage. The Matilda's turret lifted off its ring in a gout of flame and smoke. Compton and his crew died instantly, incinerated by the explosion of their own ammunition. The turret crashed back onto the hull, and the tank settled into the sand, flames pouring from every opening. The entire sequence, from shell impact to catastrophic kill, took less than 2 seconds. The other Matilda commanders, trained to focus forward on the objective, took several seconds to process what had happened. Their leader's tank, the invincible Matilda, had just been destroyed. But from where? They had seen no enemy tanks. German infantry anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate a Matilda's frontal armour at this range. Confusion rippled through the British formation. Before anyone could react, Becker's crew fired again and again. The 88mm guns positioned along the escarpment began a systematic slaughter. Each gun crew, trained to track fast-moving aircraft and calculate complex deflection shots, found stationary or slowly moving tanks almost laughably easy targets. The flat desert terrain meant there was no cover. The British tanks were exposed on open ground, silhouetted against the lighter sand, perfect targets for German gunners who had spent days preparing range cards and reference points. Lieutenant Peter Vore, commanding a troop of 3 Matildas on Compton's right flank, saw 2 of his tanks destroyed within 30 seconds of each other. The shells arrived with no warning, just the sudden crack of impact followed immediately by catastrophic explosion. His own tank was hit moments later. The shell struck the turret side, penetrating the 75mm armour and killing his gunner instantly. Vore, wounded by shell fragments, ordered his driver to reverse, but the tank's engine had been damaged. They were immobilised, sitting ducks. A second round struck the tank's front, penetrating into the engine compartment. Vaux and his surviving crew bailed out and ran for cover, machine gun fire kicking up sand around them. Of his 3-tank troop, all 3 were destroyed. He was one of only 4 crewmen to escape alive. The massacre of the Matildas at Halfaya Pass lasted approximately 20 minutes. Of the 11 tanks that began the assault, 9 were destroyed outright. 1 was immobilised by engine failure and had to be abandoned. Only 1 managed to reverse out of range, and even that tank had been hit twice, though without full penetration. The crews suffered appalling casualties. In the enclosed space of a Matilda, a penetrating hit typically killed or wounded everyone inside. Of 55 crewmen, 32 were killed and 18 wounded. Only 5 escaped unscathed. British commanders watching from observation posts were stunned. The Matilda II was supposed to be invulnerable. German 50mm anti-tank guns couldn't defeat its armour at combat ranges. Italian guns were jokes. What was destroying these tanks? Initial reports suggested German Mark IV tanks must be present, firing from concealed positions, but reconnaissance reported no German tanks in the area. The mystery deepened when artillery observers reported muzzle flashes from positions where only anti-aircraft guns were supposed to be located. The realization came slowly, hampering by disbelief. The Germans were using anti-aircraft guns in the anti-tank role, and those guns were systematically destroying the most heavily armoured tanks in the British arsenal. While the disaster unfolded at Halfaya Pass, the other prongs of Operation Brevity were meeting mixed success. At Fort Capuzzo, British forces captured the position after heavy fighting. The southern flanking column made good progress initially, but news of the catastrophe at Halfaya Pass changed everything. British commanders, realising their armour was vulnerable to German 88mm guns, became cautious. The aggressive exploitation of success that might have turned Brevity into a major victory was abandoned. Tank units refused to advance into areas where 88s might be concealed. The operational paralysis this created was as significant as the physical destruction of the Matildas. By May 28th, General Wavell, assessing the situation, concluded that Operation Brevity had failed to achieve its objectives. The Germans still held Halfaya Pass. Fort Capuzzo, though captured, was exposed to counterattack without control of the pass. The cost in tanks, particularly the irreplaceable Matildas, was unacceptable. He ordered a withdrawal. Halfaya Pass remained in German hands. Within days, Rommel counterattacked and recaptured Fort Capuzzo. The strategic situation returned to its pre-Brevity status quo, but the psychological and tactical impact of the battle would reverberate for years. The British Army had discovered, in the most brutal way possible, that German anti-aircraft guns were superior anti-tank weapons. The 88mm Flak gun's performance at Halfaya Pass was the result of multiple factors converging in a perfect combination. First, the weapon itself. The 88 had been designed to hit fast-moving aircraft at high altitude, which required exceptional muzzle velocity and flat trajectory. These same characteristics made it ideal for engaging ground targets. The standard Panzergranit 39 armour-piercing shell weighed 20 pounds and achieved a muzzle velocity of 2,790 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, this round could penetrate 105mm of armour plate set at 30 degrees from vertical. No Allied tank in North Africa in 1941 had armour that could resist this. Second, the fire control system. The 88 sights, designed for tracking aircraft, were among the most sophisticated available. The Zeiss optics provided clear target acquisition, and the gun's mechanical laying system allowed precise adjustment. Range finding was simplified in the desert environment, where atmospheric conditions were relatively consistent and targets were visible at extreme distances. Third, crew training. Luftwaffe flak crews underwent extensive training. Much of it focused on engaging fast-moving targets under combat conditions. Translating these skills to ground targets was relatively straightforward. The gun's rate of fire, 15 to 20 rounds per minute, was maintained by crews drilled to mechanical efficiency. Each man knew his role, and the loading, aiming, and firing sequence became automatic. Fourth, tactical employment. Rommel's insistence on preparing proper positions for the 88s at Halfaya Pass allowed the guns to operate at maximum effectiveness. The weapons were dug in, camouflaged, and positioned with overlapping fields of fire. Range cards had been prepared in advance. Ammunition was stockpiled in protected locations. This careful preparation multiplied the gun's inherent capabilities. Finally, British tactics played into German strengths. The frontal assault in close formation, moving slowly across open ground, presented ideal targets. The Matilda's slow speed, a consequence of their design emphasis on armour over mobility, meant they remained in the kill zone longer. The lack of artillery suppression of known German positions meant the 88 crews could operate without harassment. British tank commanders, trained to believe their armour made them invulnerable, didn't employ the covered approaches and fire and movement tactics that might have reduced casualties. The technical details of what happened when an 88mm armour-piercing round struck a Matilda tank are worth examining to understand why the results were so catastrophic. The Panzergranit 39 round consisted of a hard steel penetrator core enclosed in a softer steel jacket, with a small explosive charge and base fuse. Upon impact with armour, the round's kinetic energy and hardened core allowed it to punch through the plate. As the shell penetrated, the explosive charge detonated, sending high-velocity fragments throughout the tank's interior. The Matilda's internal layout made it particularly vulnerable to penetrating hits. The tank's crew of 4 were cramped into a small fighting compartment. The ammunition for the 2-pounder gun was stored in racks along the interior walls, unprotected by any blast shielding. A penetrating hit had a high probability of striking ammunition, and when that happened, the result was catastrophic. The British term for this was brewing up, as flames from exploding ammunition poured from the tank's hatches like a kettle boiling over. Crew survival rates from penetrating hits were abysmal. The narrow hatches and cramped interior made escape difficult under the best conditions. When the tank was on fire and filled with toxic smoke, escape was nearly impossible. Of the Matildas destroyed at Halfaya Pass, most of the crews died inside their tanks. The few survivors were those who escaped immediately after the first hit, before fire consumed the vehicle. The 8mm gun's effectiveness wasn't limited to the Matilda. British cruiser tanks with thinner armour were even more vulnerable. The Crusader tank, which would become the mainstay of British armoured units in North Africa, had a maximum of 49mm of frontal armour. The 88 could penetrate this at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Even at extreme range, no British tank was safe from the 88. German crews at Halfaya Pass reported multiple kills at ranges over 2,000 yards, distances at which British 2-pounder and even 6-pounder guns were ineffective. This range advantage fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of armoured warfare. British tanks had to close to within 500 to 800 yards to effectively engage German armour with their guns. But German 88s could kill British tanks at more than twice that range. The result was a kill zone where British tanks were vulnerable but couldn't effectively return fire. Crossing this zone required either overwhelming numbers, which the British rarely had in North Africa, or accepting catastrophic casualties. The psychological impact of the 88 on British tank crews cannot be overstated. Before Halfaya Pass, tankers in Matildas felt relatively safe. The tank's thick armour had proven resistant to every Italian weapon encountered. After Halfaya Pass, that sense of security evaporated. Every movement into potentially hostile terrain carried the fear that an unseen 88 was waiting. The crack of the gun's report, arriving simultaneously with the shell impact due to the round's supersonic velocity, meant there was no warning. One moment you were alive, the next your tank was exploding around you. Veterans described the psychological pressure as unbearable. You couldn't see the guns that could kill you. You couldn't hide from them, as there was no cover in the desert. You couldn't run from them, as most British tanks were slower than German armour. Your only hope was that the German gunners would miss, and they rarely did. After Brevity, British tactical doctrine had to be completely revised. Tank assaults without thorough reconnaissance were forbidden. Artillery suppression of suspected 88 positions became mandatory. Smoke screens were used to obscure German observation. Tank units learned to use what little cover the desert terrain offered, advancing by bounds from one hull-down position to the next. But even these measures had limited effectiveness. The 88's range and penetration meant that any position within 1,500 yards of suspected German guns was potentially fatal. Reconnaissance often couldn't identify 88 positions until they opened fire, by which time it was too late. Artillery suppression was hampered by the difficulty of locating the well-camouflaged guns and by chronic shortages of artillery ammunition. Smoke screens helped but couldn't be maintained continuously. The next major British offensive, Operation Battleaxe in June 1941, demonstrated that the lessons of Halfaya Pass had not been fully absorbed. Once again, British armour advanced into prepared German positions defended by 88s. Once again, British tanks were slaughtered. In 3 days of fighting, the British lost 91 tanks, many to 88mm guns. German tank losses were 12. The failure of Battleaxe cost General Wavell his command and delayed the relief of Tobruk by another 6 months. Throughout the summer and fall of 1941, the 88's reputation grew. Every engagement seemed to produce new horror stories of British tanks destroyed at impossible ranges, of armour that should have been proof against any weapon being penetrated as if it were paper. German crews, initially surprised by the weapon's effectiveness, became increasingly confident. Rommel, vindicated in his tactical judgment, deployed 88s with every major formation. By November 1941, when Operation Crusader launched the next major British offensive, the 88 had achieved legendary status. British tank commanders spoke of it in the same hushed tones infantrymen reserve for machine guns. The gun had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of German tactical superiority and British inadequacy. The technical arms race this triggered would define the remainder of the North African campaign. British tank designers worked frantically to develop armour and guns capable of matching the 88. The 6-pounder anti-tank gun, with better penetration than the 2-pounder, was rushed into service. American tanks, initially sent to North Africa with inadequate 37mm guns, were upgunned with 75mm weapons. But the 88 remained the gold standard. Not until the arrival of the 17-pounder anti-tank gun in 1943 did the British have a weapon that could reliably match the 88's range and penetration. The 88's success also influenced German tank design. The Tiger von Heavy tank, introduced in late 1942, mounted an 88mm gun as its main armament. For the first time, the weapon that had been so devastating in the anti-tank role was integrated into a tank chassis. The result was a vehicle that dominated battlefields wherever it appeared. The Tiger's 88mm Kh-36 gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. The psychological terror of facing an 88 was now mobile. Statistics from North Africa reveal the 88's impact. German records indicate that 88mm Flak guns in the anti-tank role accounted for approximately half of all British tanks destroyed in North Africa in 1941 and early 1942, despite the guns representing less than 5% of German anti-tank weapons in theatre. The average 88 in North Africa claimed between 10 and 15 Allied tanks, destroyed before being knocked out or withdrawn. Some guns achieved far higher scores. 188 at Halfaya Pass, possibly Becker's gun, was credited with 11 confirmed tank kills in a single day. The British response evolved slowly. Better reconnaissance helped identify 88 positions before tanks were committed. Artillery tactics improved, with concentrations of fire used to suppress suspected gun positions. Tank infantry cooperation increased, with infantry used to scout ahead and identify threats. Air power was employed more effectively, though attacking dug-in 88 positions from the air proved difficult. But perhaps the most effective British response was simply accepting that casualties would be high and maintaining the operational pressure regardless. By 1942, British production and reinforcement rates meant they could replace tank losses faster than the Germans. In the grinding attritional warfare that characterised North Africa, industrial capacity mattered as much as tactical skill. The 88 could kill British tanks with terrifying efficiency, but Britain could build tanks faster than Germany could kill them. The German perspective on the 88's success was complex. On one hand, pride in having a weapon that could dominate the battlefield. On the other, frustration that the gun was being used in a role it wasn't designed for, diverting it from anti-aircraft duties. Luftwaffe commanders resented having their Flak units subordinated to ground combat missions. They argued correctly that using 88s as anti-tank guns left German forces vulnerable to air attack. The debate reflected a deeper problem in German military organisation. The 88 was a Luftwaffe weapon, operated by Luftwaffe personnel but increasingly essential to army operations. This divided command structure created friction. Army commanders wanted more 88s for anti-tank use. Luftwaffe commanders wanted to preserve them for air defence. Rommel, through force of personality and his direct relationship with Hitler, usually got his way, but the tension never fully resolved. By 1943, the 88's dominance began to wane, not because the gun became less effective, but because Allied armour and tactics improved. The American M4 Sherman, while still vulnerable to the 88, was better protected than earlier British tanks, and had a 75mm gun capable of destroying German armour at reasonable ranges. Soviet-style tactics emphasising mass and manoeuvre replaced the more cautious British approach. Allied air superiority made it increasingly dangerous for German guns to remain stationary, but the lessons of Halfaya Pass endured. The principle that high-velocity guns with flat trajectories and good optics could dominate armoured warfare at range became fundamental to tank and anti-tank gun design. The post-war period saw every major military develop high-velocity anti-tank weapons explicitly modelled on the 88's characteristics. The British developed the 17-pounder and later the 20-pounder. The Americans developed the 90mm and 105mm tank guns. The Soviets developed the 100mm and 122mm series. All followed the same logic demonstrated at Halfaya Pass on May 27, 1941. For the men who fought at Halfaya Pass, the experience marked them permanently. British survivors spoke decades later of the terror of watching Matildas explode around them, of feeling helpless against an enemy they couldn't see or effectively engage. Many developed what would later be recognised as combat stress reactions, flinching at loud noises, experiencing nightmares of burning tanks. German gunners, while proud of their achievement, recognised they had participated in a slaughter. Some expressed discomfort at the one-sided nature of the engagement. Shooting at aircraft that could manoeuvre and shoot back was combat. Destroying tanks that couldn't effectively return fire felt, to some, more like execution than warfare. Ludwig Becker survived the North African campaign and was eventually transferred back to Germany for air defence duties. He survived the war and lived until 1982. In a 1978 interview, he reflected on Halfaya Pass. "We were just doing our jobs. The British tanks came at us and we fired. But I remember thinking, these poor bastards don't even know what's killing them. They just kept coming forward and we just kept shooting. It wasn't glorious. It was necessary, but it wasn't glorious." After the war, analysis of the Battle of Halfaya Pass became a staple of military education. British and American war colleges studied it as an example of intelligence failure and tactical rigidity. The failure to recognise the 88's anti-tank potential before committing armour to the attack was inexcusable. The inflexible adherence to doctrine in the face of unexpected resistance compounded the error. German military schools studied it as an example of successful improvisation and combined arms defence. The technical specifications of the 88mm Flak gun reveal why it was so effective. The barrel length of 56 calibers, meaning 56 times the 88mm bore diameter, gave the weapon excellent velocity characteristics. The horizontal sliding breech block allowed rapid reloading. The carriage, while heavy at 7 tons in action, was stable and allowed 360-degree traverse. The sights, particularly the Zilfenrohr 20 telescopic sight used for ground targets, provided adequate magnification and clarity. The weapon's rate of fire, theoretically 20 rounds per minute, was typically sustained at 15 rounds per minute in combat due to the need for careful aiming. But even this rate of fire meant a single gun could engage multiple targets in quick succession. At Halfaya Pass, German 88s were typically firing at 2 to 3 rounds per minute per target, ensuring first-round hits and devastating effects. The ammunition types available for the 88 included high-explosive, armour-piercing, and an armour-piercing high-explosive. Against tanks, the Panzergranit 39 armour-piercing round was standard. Later in the war, tungsten-cored Panzergranit 40 rounds with even higher penetration were developed, though these were never used in North Africa due to tungsten shortages. The logistical burden of the 88 was significant. Each gun required a crew of 11 men, though in emergencies 6 could operate it at reduced efficiency. Ammunition consumption was high, with 300 to 400 rounds considered a standard load for sustained combat. The gun's weight meant it required heavy trucks or half-tracks for towing, and once emplaced in a defensive position, it was difficult to move quickly. These logistics limitations meant 88s were typically used in set-piece defensive battles, exactly the situation that prevailed at Halfaya Pass. The broader impact of the 88's success at Halfaya Pass extended beyond North Africa. The weapon's performance drove Allied tank development for the remainder of the war. American designers, learning of the 88's capabilities, pushed for heavier armour and bigger guns on their tanks. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, though it arrived too late to see significant combat in World War II, was a direct response to the 88's dominance. Soviet designers, already inclined toward heavy armour and large-caliber guns, found their approach validated. British designers, traumatised by their tank's vulnerability, went to extremes. The Churchill tank, with armour up to 152mm thick, was designed specifically to resist 88mm fire. But even this thick armour could be penetrated by later variants of the 88 at combat ranges. The arms race between gun and armour, always a feature of armoured warfare, accelerated dramatically after Halfaya Pass. Every increase in armour thickness drove development of more powerful guns. Every new gun drove demands for thicker armour. By war's end, German heavy tanks mounted guns that could penetrate 200mm of armour at 1,000 yards, while Soviet heavy tanks carried armour up to 160mm thick. This spiral of escalation began at Halfaya Pass on May 27, 1941. From a technical perspective, the 88's success shouldn't have been surprising. The mathematics of armour penetration were well understood. High velocity plus adequate projectile mass equals penetration. The 88 had both. What was surprising was the psychological and doctrinal unpreparedness of Allied forces to face such a weapon. British doctrine, developed through experience against Italian forces in 1940 and early 1941, assumed tank armour was sufficient protection against anti-tank weapons. This assumption was reasonable given Italian anti-tank gun capabilities, but catastrophically wrong when applied to German weapons. The doctrine failure was compounded by intelligence failure. British intelligence in North Africa knew the Germans had 88mm flak guns. They knew these were high-velocity weapons. They knew German forces in Spain had used them against tanks. but somehow this information never translated into tactical warnings for tank units. The result was commanders sending their tanks into battle against an enemy capability they didn't know existed. Modern military analysis categorizes Halfaya Pass as a meeting engagement where one side had dramatically superior intelligence and preparation. The Germans knew British capabilities, having captured numerous British tanks and studied their armour. The British didn't understand German capabilities, specifically regarding the 88. This information asymmetry was decisive. In retrospect, the Battle of Halfaya Pass was a watershed moment in World War II. It demonstrated that tactical innovation and superior weapons could offset numerical disadvantages. It showed that assumptions about invulnerability were dangerous. It proved that specialized weapons could be effectively employed in roles they weren't designed for. Most importantly, it established a psychological ascendancy that would affect the North African campaign for the next 18 months. The legend of the 88 grew from that day. British troops came to fear it as the deadliest weapon in the German arsenal. That fear, as much as the weapon's actual capabilities, shaped how battles were fought. Commanders became cautious, unwilling to risk armour against suspected 88 positions. This caution, while reducing casualties, also reduced operational tempo and limited the exploitation of successes. The Germans, recognising the psychological effect, sometimes deployed dummy 88 positions complete with fake guns to deter British advances. For Commander John Compton and the other British tank crewmen who died at Halfaya Pass, there would be no vindication. They drove into battle confident in their armour's protection and their own skill. They died before understanding what killed them. Their sacrifice, however, was not meaningless. The lessons learned at Halfaya Pass, written in their blood, eventually led to better tactics, better intelligence, and better equipment for Allied forces. By 1945, Allied tanks could match or exceed German armour in quality and vastly exceeded it in quantity. But in May 1941, at a narrow pass in the desert, the 88mm Flak gun announced its presence on the battlefield with devastating effect. The Matildas exploding on the approaches to Halfaya Pass marked the beginning of the 88's reign as the most feared anti-tank weapon of World War II. That reign, born in an obscure desert battle that most people have never heard of, would last until war's end and influence military technology for decades afterward. The thunder of those first shots echoed far beyond the desert, changing forever how armies thought about armour, guns, and the eternal struggle between penetration and protection. The strategic implications of Halfaya Pass rippled outward through both armies with surprising speed. Within 48 hours of the battle, every British armour unit in North Africa had been briefed on the 88 threat. Tank commanders who had previously led from the front now hung back, using binoculars to scan for the telltale signatures of concealed guns. The change in British tactics was immediate and profound. Where before reconnaissance had been cursory, now it became obsessive. Artillery observers were trained to recognise the distinctive muzzle flash of an 88. Infantry patrols were sent forward to probe German positions before tanks were committed. Close air support requests multiplied as commanders sought to neutralise suspected gun positions from the air. But identifying 88 positions before they opened fire proved nearly impossible. The gun's low profile when dug in, combined with German skill at camouflage, meant they remained invisible until that first devastating shot. And by then, it was usually too late. The crew of a tank 1,200 yards away had perhaps 1.5 seconds between the gun firing and the shell arriving. Not enough time to react, barely enough time to register the danger. The Germans, recognising they had stumbled onto a war-winning tactical innovation, began systematically integrating 88s into their defensive planning. Rommel issued orders that every defensive position must include at least one 88 battery position to cover the most likely British approach routes. Luftwaffe Flak units found themselves increasingly tasked with ground defence missions, much to the frustration of their commanders who worried about leaving German positions vulnerable to RAF attack. The organisational tension this created was significant. Luftwaffe personnel operated under different command structures, had different supply chains, and answered to different headquarters than army units. Coordinating the employment of Luftwaffe 88s in support of army operations required constant negotiation and compromise. Rommel's solution was characteristically direct. He simply requisitioned Flak units for ground operations and dealt with the bureaucratic complaints later. His personal relationship with Hitler gave him latitude other commanders lacked. By June 1941, German tactical doctrine had evolved to centre around the 88. The basic concept was simple, but devastatingly effective. German tanks, typically Mark IIIs and Mark IVs with 50mm and 75mm guns respectively, would engage British armour at medium range, drawing them forward into pursuit. The British, thinking they faced only tanks, would advance aggressively. Then, at ranges of 1,500 to 2,000 yards, concealed 88s would open fire, catching the British tanks in a kill zone where they were vulnerable but couldn't effectively return fire. German tanks would then disengage while the 88s completed the destruction of British armour. This tactic, which German tankers called the 88 trap, proved brutally effective throughout the summer of 1941. British tank losses mounted alarmingly. In June alone, the British lost 64 tanks to 88mm fire, representing over 40% of total tank losses that month. The Germans lost 9 tanks total. The kill ratio was unsustainable for a force already operating at the end of a long supply line. The psychological impact on British tankers intensified. Veterans began developing superstitious behaviours meant to ward off 88 fire. Some refused to advance in straight lines, zigzagging constantly despite the strain this placed on engines and transmissions. Others insisted on spreading their formations to maximum width, hoping that dispersed targets would be harder to engage. Some crews welded additional armour plate onto their tanks, improvised protection that added weight and reduced performance, but provided psychological comfort. Medical officers began reporting increasing cases of combat stress among tank crews. Men who had performed bravely in previous engagements became paralysed with fear when ordered forward. The term 88 shock entered informal military vocabulary, describing a specific trauma response associated with the helplessness of facing the German gun. Several experienced tank commanders had to be relieved of duty, their nerves shattered by repeatedly watching comrades die in burning tanks. The British attempted various technological solutions to the 88 problem. One proposal involved mounting additional armour plates on Matildas, creating super-heavy tanks immune to 88 fire. Testing revealed this was impractical. The additional weight would have reduced the already slow Matilda to walking pace and overstressed the engine and transmission beyond acceptable limits. Moreover, weight calculations suggested that armour thick enough to reliably stop 88 rounds at all ranges would have required plates over 120mm thick, adding nearly 10 tons to the tank's weight. Another proposal involved smoke generation equipment that would allow tanks to create their own concealment. Limited trials showed promise, but the smoke generators were bulky, reduced ammunition storage, and required frequent refilling. More fundamentally, smoke didn't prevent 88s from firing, it just made aiming harder, and given the 88's flat trajectory and the wide killing zone its 8 guns could create at converged ranges, even degraded accuracy was sufficient for kills. A third approach focused on improving British anti-tank guns. The 6-pounder gun, with 57mm bore and significantly better armour penetration than the 2-pounder, was already in development. Production was accelerated and the first units reached North Africa in November 1941. But even the 6-pounder couldn't match the 88's combination of range and penetration. British doctrine began emphasising close-range ambushes where the 6-pounder's hitting power could be employed before German 88s could engage. The American entry into the war following Pearl Harbor in December 1941 promised a solution through sheer industrial capacity. American tank production was ramping up to levels that dwarfed anything Britain or Germany could achieve. But the initial American designs, particularly the M3 Grant with its sponson-mounted 75mm gun and the early M4 Sherman with thin armour, were arguably even more vulnerable to 88 fire than British tanks. American tankers arriving in North Africa in 1942 would learn the same bitter lessons British crews had learned at Halfaya Pass. The Germans, meanwhile, were learning their own lessons about the 88's limitations. The gun's weight and size made it difficult to move quickly. Once emplaced in a defensive position, it took hours to dig out and redeploy. This meant 88s were essentially fixed fortifications, deadly within their field of fire but unable to respond to rapid battlefield changes. Mobile warfare, which Rommel preferred, required leaving 88s behind or accepting long delays while they were repositioned. The gun's ammunition consumption was another concern. Each 88 round weighed 31 pounds complete, and a gun could fire through hundreds of rounds in an extended engagement. Supplying adequate ammunition to forward positions across the Mediterranean and then across the desert proved challenging. Several German counteroffensives had to be curtailed when 88 batteries ran low on ammunition at critical moments. Personnel losses were also a factor. While the 88's range protected it from most British tanks, it was vulnerable to artillery fire once located. British doctrine evolved to include immediate artillery strikes on any position from which 88 fire was observed. A single well-placed artillery salvo could kill most of an 88 crew and damage the gun beyond field repair. The Luftwaffe's trained Flak personnel were difficult to replace, and by mid-1942 crew quality was declining as experienced gunners were killed or transferred. The battle that best demonstrated both the 88's capabilities and its limitations was the defence of the Gazala line in May and June 1942. The British had established a defensive line running south from Gazala, on the coast deep into the desert, anchored by fortified boxes that were supposed to be mutually supporting. The Germans attacked on May 26th with a sweeping flanking movement around the southern end of the line. The ensuing battle would become the largest tank engagement in the North African campaign, and would see 88s employed on an unprecedented scale. At the Knightsbridge box, roughly in the centre of the British position, 4 88mm guns were positioned to cover the approaches from the east. These guns were part of the 135th Flak Regiment and were manned by experienced crews who had been in North Africa since March 1941. Several gunners had participated in the Halfaya Pass action. On June 6, 1942, the British launched a major armoured attack toward Knightsbridge, attempting to cut off German supply lines. The attack involved elements of the 2nd and 22nd Armoured Brigades, fielding over 100 tanks including the newest models with improved armour and guns. The British advance began at dawn, with tanks moving in a broad formation, designed to minimise vulnerability to concentrated fire. Artillery preparation had been thorough, with suspected German positions subjected to hour-long bombardments. Reconnaissance had identified several possible 88 locations, and these had been specifically targeted. British commanders were confident they had suppressed or destroyed the German anti-tank guns. They were wrong. The outs at Knightsbridge had been positioned in carefully constructed pits with overhead cover that protected them from artillery fragments. The crews had sheltered during the bombardment, emerging only when the British tanks came into view. At 7:23 a.m, the first 88 opened fire at a range of 1,200 yards. The target was a Crusader III, one of the newest British cruiser tanks with improved armour and a 6-pounder gun. The 88's shell struck the Crusader's turret, penetrating completely and detonating the ammunition. The tank exploded with such violence that debris landed over 50 yards away. Within the next 2 minutes, 3 more British tanks were destroyed. The advancing British formation, caught in open ground with no cover, attempted to locate the German guns. But the 88s, dug into positions that showed only their barrels and shields, were nearly invisible against the desert background. British tanks began firing at suspected positions, but the range was too great for effective counter-battery fire. The 2-pounder and even 6-pounder guns lacked the reach to engage targets over 2,000 yards away. The British commander, Brigadier William Carr, recognised he was caught in the same trap that had destroyed the Matildas at Halfaya Pass a year earlier. He ordered smoke and a fighting withdrawal, but the 88s continued firing through the smoke, using pre-registered aiming points. By the time British armour pulled back out of range, 14 tanks had been destroyed and another 8 damaged. The Germans had suffered no casualties and no equipment losses. The attack on Knightsbridge had failed before it truly began. Over the next 2 weeks, as the Battle of Gazala developed into a grinding attritional struggle, the 88s positioned throughout the German lines extracted a terrible toll. British armour, attempting to outflank German positions or counterattack German advances, repeatedly ran into curtains of 88 fire. The British official history records that between May 26th and June 13th, 1942, 242 British tanks were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. German records attribute 138 of these kills to 88mm guns. The Germans lost 114 tanks total, creating a kill ratio of more than 2-to-1 in Germany's favour. The Battle of Gazala culminated in a British defeat and retreat. Tobruk, which had held out for 8 months during the 1941 siege, fell to German assault in a single day on June 21, 1942. The rapidity of the collapse shocked the British High Command and led to a crisis of confidence in British armour tactics and equipment. Prime Minister Churchill, receiving news of Tobruk's fall while meeting with President Roosevelt in Washington, was devastated. He later wrote that it was one of the heaviest blows of the war. The 88's role in the Gazala defeat was significant, but not exclusive. German tactical skill, Rommel's operational brilliance, British command failures, and simple bad luck all contributed. But the 88 had created a psychological ascendancy that paralysed British armoured operations. Commanders hesitated to commit tanks, knowing that unseen 88s might be waiting. This hesitation allowed German forces to seize and maintain initiative. The fear of the 88 had become as effective as the weapon itself. By July 1942, as German forces pursued the retreating British into Egypt and approached the El Alamein position, the 88 had achieved near mythical status. British soldiers spoke of it with a mixture of respect and dread. Intelligence reports described it in almost supernatural terms, suggesting it could penetrate any armour at any range. While these reports were exaggerated, they reflected genuine trauma in the British ranks. Tank crews requested transfers to infantry. Morale among armour units reached its lowest point of the war. The turning point came at El Alamein, not because the 88 became less effective, but because British tactics finally evolved to counter it effectively. General Bernard Montgomery, taking command of the 8th Army in August 1942, implemented several crucial changes. First, he insisted on thorough artillery preparation before any armour advance, with suspected 88 positions subjected to sustained counter-battery fire. Second, he emphasised night operations when the 88's long-range accuracy was negated. Third, he built up overwhelming material superiority before attacking, accepting that casualties would be high, but ensuring they could be sustained. The Second Battle of El Alamein, beginning on October 23, 1942, saw these new tactics implemented on a massive scale. British artillery, outnumbering German guns by more than 3-1, subjected Axis positions to bombardments of unprecedented intensity. When British armour advanced, it did so behind creeping barrages that suppressed German anti-tank guns. Night attacks forced German defenders to engage at close range where British numerical superiority could be brought to bear. The 88s at El Alamein still exacted a heavy price. Between October 23 and November 4, German records credit 88mm guns with 201 British tank kills, but the British, with over 1,000 tanks available and replacements flowing from Egypt, could absorb these losses. For every British tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. The Germans, operating at the end of a supply line that crossed the Mediterranean under constant air and submarine attack, couldn't replace their losses. When 88s ran out of ammunition, or their crews were killed, there were no replacements. By November 4th, when Rommel began his retreat from El Alamein, the 88's aura of invincibility had been broken. Not because the weapon had become less deadly, but because British forces had learned to accept casualties and maintain operational pressure regardless. The industrial and material superiority of the Allied coalition was finally being brought to bear in a way German tactical excellence couldn't overcome. The retreat from El Alamein saw 88s used in a new role, as rearguard weapons covering German withdrawals. Guns would be positioned to cover retreat routes, engage pursuing British armour, then be withdrawn before they could be outflanked. This mobile defence in depth exploited the 88's strengths while minimising its weaknesses. A single 88, properly positioned, could delay a British brigade for hours, buying time for German forces to escape encirclement. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt of the 20th Flak Division commanded an 88 battery during the retreat from El Alamein. His after-action reports describe a brutal pattern repeated dozens of times. His guns would deploy at dawn, covering a narrow pass or defile that British armour had to traverse. When British tanks appeared, the 88s would fire until either they ran low on ammunition or British forces began working around the flanks. Then the guns would be limbered up and towed to the next defensive position, perhaps 20 or 30 miles back. At the new position, the pattern would repeat. Schmidt's battery destroyed 34 British tanks during the 1,400-mile retreat from El Alamein to Tunisia, losing 2 guns to air attack and 1 to being overrun when withdrawal was delayed by mechanical problems. The campaign in Tunisia from November 1942 to May 1943 saw the 88 employed in increasingly desperate circumstances. German and Italian forces, trapped in a shrinking perimeter and cut off from adequate supplies, used their limited number of 88s to create killing zones that Allied armour couldn't penetrate without prohibitive losses. At the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, 88s positioned on the heights overlooking the pass destroyed 44 American tanks in 2 days, teaching American forces the same painful lessons the British had learned at Halfaya Pass. But by this stage of the war, Allied material superiority was overwhelming. For every 88 shell fired, Allied forces could respond with 100 artillery rounds. For every German tank destroyed, 3 Allied tanks appeared in its place. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. When Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered in May 1943, over 275,000 German and Italian troops went into captivity. Among the captured equipment were 38 serviceable 88mm guns, all that remained of the hundreds that had served in North Africa. The 88's legacy extended far beyond North Africa. The gun's success influenced tank and anti-tank gun design for the remainder of the war and beyond. Soviet designers studying intelligence reports on the 88 developed their own high-velocity guns, including the 85mm and 100mm series. American designers created the 90mm gun, explicitly intended to match 88 performance. British designers developed the 17-pounder, which finally gave British forces a gun that could engage German armour on equal terms. More fundamentally, the 88 demonstrated that high-velocity guns with good optics and well-trained crews could dominate armoured warfare. The post-war period saw every major military adopt this lesson. Tank guns became larger and more powerful, with velocity and penetration prioritised over rate of fire or shell weight. Anti-tank guided missiles, when they appeared in the 1960s, simply automated the principles the 88 had demonstrated: long-range precision engagement of armour from concealed positions. The 88 also influenced tactical doctrine regarding the relationship between tanks and anti-tank weapons. The German experience showed that defensive anti-tank weapons, properly employed, could defeat attacking armour at favourable casualty ratios. This led post-war militaries to invest heavily in anti-tank capabilities, creating specialised units and developing weapons specifically for killing tanks. The Cold War-era NATO strategy of using anti-tank weapons to blunt Soviet armoured attacks owed much to lessons learned from the 88 in North Africa. For the veterans who faced the 88, memories remained vivid decades after the war. British tank crewmen, interviewed in the 1970s and 1980s for oral history projects, spoke of the terror of facing an unseen enemy that could kill you instantly from ranges where you couldn't fight back. Many described the distinctive crack of the 88 firing as the most frightening sound they had ever heard. Worse than artillery, worse than bombing, because it meant death was already in flight toward you. German gunners, when they spoke of their experiences, emphasized the mechanical nature of the killing. You weren't fighting soldiers, you were destroying machines. The human beings inside the tanks were abstractions until you saw the survivors, burned and wounded, being pulled from wreckage. Some expressed pride in their technical skill. Others expressed discomfort at the one-sided nature of many engagements. Most simply noted they had done what was required of them in circumstances they didn't choose. The statistical record of the 88 in North Africa is incomplete, as German record-keeping broke down during the chaotic retreats of late 1942 and early 1943. Conservative estimates credit 88mm Flak guns with approximately 900 Allied tanks destroyed in North Africa between April 1941 and May 1943. Given that total Allied tank losses in the theatre were approximately 2,800, this means 88s accounted for roughly one-third of all British and American tanks destroyed, despite representing less than 10% of German anti-tank weapons in theatre. No other weapon system achieved comparable effectiveness. The human cost behind these statistics was staggering. Each destroyed tank typically meant 3 to 5 killed or wounded crewmen. The 900 tank kills credited to 88s therefore represent at least 3,000 Allied casualties, most of them killed instantly or dying shortly after from wounds or burns. For a weapon that was never intended to fight ground targets, that entered service as an anti-aircraft gun, this combat record was extraordinary and terrible. The 88mm Flak gun's transformation from anti-aircraft weapon to the most feared anti-tank gun of World War II began at Halfaya Pass on May 27, 1941. The destruction of Commander Compton's Matildas that morning demonstrated what high velocity and good training could achieve against armour. The lesson, written in fire and blood on the desert sand, changed armoured warfare forever. Every tank designed since, every anti-tank weapon developed, every tactical doctrine for employing armour against prepared defences has been influenced by what happened when Ludwig Becker's gun crew opened fire on those advancing British tanks. The crack of that first 88 round at Halfaya Pass echoed across the remainder of World War II and into the decades beyond. It announced that armour alone was no longer sufficient protection, that mobility and firepower could defeat even the heaviest tanks, that the offence-defence balance in armoured warfare had shifted fundamentally. For the British tankers who died that day there could be no consolation, but their sacrifice brought knowledge that eventually helped their successors develop tactics and equipment to counter the German advantage. By 1945, when Allied tanks rolled into Germany itself, they did so having learned to survive and prevail against the weapon that had first bloodied them so terribly in the North African desert. The 88 remained deadly to the end, but it no longer dominated battlefields as it had at Halfaya Pass. Industrial might, tactical evolution, and sheer determination had overcome even this formidable weapon. But for anyone who faced it in 1941 or 1942, when British armour was outmatched and German gunners were confident and skilled, the 88mm gun remained the deadliest thing in the desert, a mechanical executioner that killed from impossible ranges without warning or mercy,